I call the clerk.
General Business Order of the Day, number 61, Franchising Laws Amendment, Fairness in Franchising Bill 2020, resumption of second reading debate.
Thank you. Senator O'Neill.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President, and I'm pleased as a Labor Senator today to rise and speak on the Franchising Laws Amendment, Ombudsman and Fairness Measures Bill 2020. The bill is a practical, albeit limited, response to the work that was started in the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services and delivered a unanimous report with the support of none other than John Wacker-Williams, the very effective National Senator, who delivered this Fairness in Franchising Bill inquiry. Today, this is a bill for fairness for small businesses. It proposes urgently needed and necessary reforms to add appropriate and meaningful balance to a multi-billion-dollar industry that was shown to be inappropriately regulated and with an ineffective code of conduct, rife with unjust practices. The franchising sector produces almost 7% of our GDP and is ubiquitous across the country. I think Australians would struggle to name a town or suburb that doesn't feature one franchise business or another, whether it be a petrol station, a cafe or fast food restaurant. This sector has been the subject of 17 inquiries over the last 30 years due to the chronic and endemic issues that are continually played out in the media and through the trials and traumas of hundreds of small businesses across the country. We cannot delay reform anymore. We don't need another inquiry. We don't need another task force or another round table. This bill takes long overdue action. As the inquiry report, and I remind senators that it was a unanimous report, noted, and I quote, "The evidence to this inquiry indicates that the problems, including exploitation in certain franchise systems, are systemic. The franchise agreement embeds the power disparity between franchisor and franchisee for the duration of the contract, including the exit arrangements. The Joint Parliamentary Committee received a raft of evidence about how the abuse of contractual power can manifest in a franchise agreement. Further, the committee also received evidence that pointed to shortcomings in the regulatory responses, such as the duty to act in good faith and the unfair contract term provisions. We found disgusting practices such as churning and burning. For those who don't know, churning refers to the repeated sale by the franchisor at a single site of a failed franchise to a new franchisee. Burning refers to continually opening new outlets, some of which are unlikely to be viable, to profit from the upfront fees that the franchisor acquires while leaving existing outlets to struggle and to close. Both that churning and burning, while making money for the franchisor, sometimes hundreds of $1,000s a turn, leaves franchisees emotionally and financially battered and their dreams of owning their own business in tatters. The extent and the breadth of misconduct and exploitation by franchisors within the franchisee sector demonstrates that disclosure and transparency alone, while vitally important, are an insufficient response to power and information asymmetry. And that is part of what this bill seeks to do. It will empower the Small Business Ombudsman to recommend arbitration in the same way that it is able to for the Dairy Code. The inability of franchisees to effectively pursue disputes or breaches of contract through the current framework was one of the key findings of the inquiry. My colleagues from all parties delivered this unanimous report noting many cases of bullying and intimidation. Justice in the courts was not available because the powerful and those loaded up with dollars had access, but a franchisee that's been ruined had no recourse. The bill will provide an optional binding alternative dispute resolution that is determined by an expert in the field. It also furnishes the Ombudsman with the power to name and shame those who don't take the recommendation for arbitration. The reforms proposed in this bill are interdependent and form a holistic framework to reshape the landscape for the current franchising sector. The bill will increase the quantum of penalties for breaches of an industry code in the Competition and Consumer Act 2010 from $66,000 up to a potential $10 million, or 10% of the annual turnover of the corporation, or 3 times the benefit that the corporation directly or indirectly obtained from the breach, whichever is higher. In 2019, the ACCC recommended a parliamentary inquiry into franchising to increase the penalties of the breaches from $66,000 to $10 million to deter bad behaviour from franchisors. The imbalance of power that this inquiry found was unfortunately accompanied by an imbalance in education. The upgrade of engagement capacity with the Ombudsman will allow the Ombudsman to address this by providing trusted and unbiased help. Small businesses are being driven into economic peril by a sector that's shown it's incapable of self-policing or renewal. As was reported in the inquiry, there are deeply rooted cultural problems that will not be resolved by franchisors replacing a few senior executives. Australian businesses have waited long enough. I've waited long enough. Labor is standing up for franchisees here today. We're sick and tired of waiting for the government to get its act together and implement the recommendations in the committee's report. We cannot rebuild our economy when such a large sector that engages 7% of the GDP remains institutionally broken and unjust. I believe in small businesses. I come from a family that came to this country to build a future, and they did that by building a small business. So many hard-working immigrants have seen franchising as a way to learn safely about the Australian business sector, only to be totally ripped off by people exploiting the current structures. They need this legislation to provide protection. There is much, much more that the government could do, but from opposition, this is our significant effort to support small businesses at a critical point of need, and I urge the government and the crossbenchers to stand with Australian franchisees and pass this bill.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill. Senator Brockman.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy Chair. I'll start by, just as Senator O'Neill did, acknowledging the work in this space of members on this side, particularly the long and enduring interest of Senator Wacker-Williams into this particular topic. But that is a tradition that has been carried on by a number of others in this place. We've been joined recently by Senator Ben Small, who's obviously got a very strong background in small business sector. We've got David Van sitting in the chamber here at the moment, who has a keen and abiding interest in this topic as well. So Senator Williams' concerns expressed over a great number of years in this place are continued and are being acted upon by those on this side. And for the small business community, there is nothing better than a strong and durable economy. With the shock that we have faced over the past 12 months, an extraordinary shock to the global economy, an extraordinary shock to the Australian economy. But in another piece of very good news today, I'll just inform the chamber that Fitch has reaffirmed Australia's AAA credit rating. They said that the Australian economy has weathered the pandemic well compared to its peers. The performance reflects successful virus containment and effective fiscal and monetary response consistent with policy framework that has underpinned the economic resilience to shocks over the medium term. And one of the drivers of this is our small business sector, and one of the key drivers of the small business sector is our franchise sector, and in particular the many, many small business franchisees. So with respect, Senator O'Neill, I understand where you're coming from with this bill, but what you are doing is misguided, and it fails completely to acknowledge both the commitment of this government to the small business sector, to the franchise sector, what this government has done and what this government is doing to assist this sector. Completely fails to acknowledge those facts. And I think that comes down to a very simple proposition of why that's the case, because those on the other side do not understand small business and have never understood small business. The franchising sector of our economy is predominantly small business. So those on the other side will always struggle to understand it. Franchising is a very significant part of the Australian economy. It's a $154 billion sector in the 2021 financial year. There's around 91,000 franchisees across Australia, 1,200 franchise systems, 500,000 people employed within the franchise sector, and as I have said, almost all of the franchise sector is made up of small businesses. When we think of the franchise sector, all too often it's too easy just to think of your retail fast food chains, be it a McDonald's or a coffee club, or perhaps a chain of hotels that operates under a franchise model. That's the obvious part of the franchising sector. But when you think about it a little more deeply, you see that the franchising sector operates right throughout the economy, whether it's sign making, whether it's graphics and printing businesses, whether it's in the construction sector, the wholesale trade sector, including the food sector, the retail trade sector, obviously the most predominant, but we also see it significantly in the transport sector. We see it in the financial services sector, in rental, hiring and real estate services. We see it in things like administrative support services such as mowing services, trampoline parks, swim schools, pet care services, auto repair shops, auto repair servicing, IT, hairdressing, beauty salons. The franchising sector spreads across the entire economy. And that means we have a diverse range of small businesses, a diverse range of franchising models, and a diverse range of Australians who are working, living in these businesses, and we have to, as a government, support them in a responsible manner, to acknowledge that what they do is a very valuable part of the economy, and to put in place a regulatory structure that actually delivers for those small businesses right across the Australian economy. Support for small and medium-sized family businesses and the franchising sector is something that the Australian government does have as a very important priority, and absolutely acknowledges the issues that came out of the Fairness in Franchising report. The report did identify a range of misconduct by franchisors. Now, egregious conduct was not widespread, but it was present, and it did significantly and devastatingly impact on a number of franchisees. In August 2020, the Morrison government announced its commitment to introduce stronger protections and greater transparency to the franchising sector. In fact, the government's already outlined a suite of reforms to restore confidence in this sector, and I must say I think a large part of the sector demonstrates its confidence through its continuing operation and successful operation throughout the pandemic year. But to add to that, we want to lift franchisor standards of conduct and improve the information available to all franchisees. Draft amendments to the franchising code have been released. These include such things as improving disclosure on significant capital expenditure, supplier rebates and, most importantly, marketing funds, preventing franchisors from passing on legal costs to franchisees and retrospective variations to franchise agreements, to improve end-of-franchise relationships, including cooling-off periods, early exits, terminations and any restraint of trade arrangements, strengthening the dispute resolution options and doubling penalties to deter poor conduct in this sector. The government will provide franchisees greater protection by ensuring they have the information they need before they enter a franchise agreement. Senator O'Neill's bill does not address these much-needed protections. The government will implement a stronger framework to lift franchisor standards of conduct. We're committed to timely implementation of reform to restore confidence in the franchising sector and committed to getting these reforms right. This will mean working with the sector to make sure that the implementations of the reforms is done properly. In particular, that means working with that great diversity in the franchising sector that I spoke about earlier. This is not a one-size-fits-all sector. This is an extraordinary complex sector an extraordinary number of participants in it, a large number of different business models, and the idea that one size will fit all in such an environment just shows how little understanding of the small business sector those on the other side actually have. The government's response will comprehensively address a much larger range of issues identified in the Fairness in Franchising report than the few limited measures that appear in Senator O'Neill's private senator's bill. This would amount to a piecemeal approach, an approach which doesn't address many of the systemic problems identified in that Fairness in Franchising report and fails to take into account that great diversity and the great variation in franchising that we see in the Australian economy. I know my colleagues have a contribution to make as well, so I will curtail my remarks there, Madam Acting Deputy President. But let me just say that those on this side of the chamber are the strongest supporters of our franchise sector, the strongest supporters of the franchisees, small business people who are out there trying to do the best for them, for their families, for their employees, and we certainly have their backs. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brockman. Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. It would be very surprising then, if you are the strongest supporter of franchisees and small business, Senator, that you wouldn't be supporting this bill here today. This bill and the recommendations of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services, which are reflected in this bill, has the support of the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the Council of Small Business Organisations Australia, COSBOA, Australian Automotive Dealers Association, and the Australian Association of Franchisees. Pretty comprehensive across the board representation there. And Mr Peter Strong, who many of us in this place know very well and I would dare to say are also very fond of, the CEO of the Council of Small Business Organisations of Australia, made the argument that when a franchisor exploits their small business franchisees, they're not just exploiting a business, they're ruining the lives of the people who own the business and their families too. These people might lose their house and everything they have and often go through extreme emotional stress and turmoil. They don't have the resources to go to court, which is why making inexpensive arbitration available through the Ombudsman is so important. And having participated on the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services myself, in a sense that that committee and those Senate hearings became part of the work to get some justice for these franchisees because they didn't have the resources to go to court. The Parliament, this place, ended up stepping in, calling as witnesses, and if I remember rightly, and Senator O'Neill, who was also on that inquiry, if she'd been here, would agree with this. Certainly my time in this place, over 9 years, the first time we've ever had to compel a witness to appear before a Senate inquiry. Indeed, the witness, a very wealthy franchisor from Queensland, took it to the High Court, and the Senate won. The Parliament won in the High Court, and we had to compel this guy and his team and his band of lawyers to actually come to this Parliament and answer questions. That's how important this inquiry was, to help represent the small businesses and the people behind those small businesses, the franchisees in this country. And of course, as I said, a number of recommendations there, nearly 76 recommendations, many of which are reflected in this bill today. Now, I understand there's currently around 2.4 million small businesses operating in Australia, around 90% of all businesses, in terms of numbers, employing roughly 4.7 million people, around 41% of Australia's workforce. I've run a small business myself. I'm not sure whether you'd say successfully or not. I wound my company up recently because I became a senator and could no longer be a winemaker. But my wife is still very successfully running a small business and employs 25 people in my local town of Launceston. We understand what it's like to run a small business and employ people. and how difficult it can be to be the only one really who's getting up in the morning to make sure the wheels are turning and that employees get paid and clients get serviced. Franchisees are an important part of this small business community. There's nearly 100,000 franchise businesses in Australia employing over 500,000 people. Franchisees provide everything from food to entertainment to personal and household services, often with globally or nationally recognised names, but always with a local flavour and connection. And although it's never been easy for small businesses, it's probably never been tougher than it is right now. And may I say, I'm very glad the government listened to many of us in here and brought in JobKeeper at the beginning of this global pandemic. I myself was one of the first people calling for a living wage. I know there were other people in this place that were also looking at what was happening in New Zealand and the UK. I spoke to COSBOA, a number of small business associations around the country, the Chamber of Commerce in my own state, and asked them to lobby really hard to get a living wage for workers because we didn't want to shut our small businesses down. We were told we couldn't open. We were told we weren't able to operate. People couldn't come and see us. Yet we didn't want to shut those businesses down. We didn't want to send workers to go and join the queue down at Centrelink. We wanted an alternative. And the government, to their credit, listened. After a couple of weeks, the trade unions, the Chamber of Commerces, and it was a really interesting alliance between business and the union movement to help deliver this living wage. Now, it wasn't perfect. It needed lots of tweaking. It's probably not the way we would have designed it if we'd had a chance. But nevertheless, I think we all agree in this place paying workers a living wage during tough times like this has worked really well. It really is one of the few things that have kept us literally, pardon the pun, in business in the last 12 months. On top of that, we've got technological disruptions and a flatlining economy. And of course, we're not through this pandemic yet, not by a long means. With an exit rate of around 13%, small business failure is on the increase, and it's only going to get worse before it gets better. If the government was serious about supporting its economic engine room, it would accept the 71 recommendations made by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporation and Financial Services and their report on the operation and effectiveness of the Franchising Code of Conduct, instead of just fiddling at the margins. And a good start to that commitment would be supporting this bill here today. And I am actually genuinely surprised that the government isn't supporting it. The Greens stand with the Ombudsman, with the unions, with peak bodies and Australian small business and franchisees in supporting this bill. And just largely, may I congratulate Senator O'Neill for bringing this bill forward, and for I know the amount of hard work she put in to that inquiry and getting this to here today. And I may also acknowledge, excuse me, previous Senator John Wacker Williams, who I think Senator O'Neill and I and others have worked with very closely over many years. I participated in this inquiry, but certainly wasn't a driver like these two were. But I know over the years Wacker contributed to much good that's been done in this place. So I urge the government to support this bill.
Thank you, Senator Whish-Wilson. Senator Small.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. The government does not support Senator O'Neill's bill, not because we are deaf to the plight of small business in Australia, not because we haven't heard the very clear message from listening to franchisees across Australia, but instead because this bill seeks to make a political pre-selection stunt out of what the government considers are very real issues. And I look forward to explaining in detail why the proposed Morrison government's legislation will go much further to meaningfully addressing franchises in Australia and the very real impact that it has on small business in this country. The government has already taken strong action to introduce additional protections and greater transparency in the franchising sector in Australia. Our reforms will cover a much broader range of issues in a more fundamental and carefully considered way than those put forward by Senator O'Neill. And I look forward to the support of Senator Whish-Wilson and the crossbench when we actually address the concerns of those Australians. The broad range of problems identified in the Fairness in Franchising report are real. Seeking to implement the very limited number of Senator O'Neill's proposals now would be a piecemeal approach and detract from the timely consideration and the carefully considered implementation of a full range of reforms that are clearly required in this sector. Replicating the multi-party mediation provisions in the government's response to the Fairness in Franchising report is not where we need to be. The Morrison government has already proposed these reforms on multi-party dispute resolution, and they go significantly further than the reforms contemplated in Senator O'Neill's bill. Where appropriate, multi-party dispute resolution will be compulsory for franchisors. Under Senator O'Neill's proposed bill, franchisors would still need to agree to engage in multi-party dispute resolution. The government's approach, instead, will allow franchisees to share the costs of dispute resolution, promoting access to justice for those who need it and addressing the clear power imbalance in some cases between franchisors and franchisees. The Morrison government is clearly on the side of small business people in this case. Senator O'Neill's bill calls for optional binding alternative dispute resolution. However, we have already committed to introducing voluntary binding arbitration into the franchising code. That has simply been cut and pasted into Senator O'Neill's bill. The Morrison government will go further than that bill by recognising that conciliation is an important form of dispute resolution that should be available to franchisors and franchisees. The government's committed to this franchising dispute resolution assistance also via the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman's Office, recognising the importance of the role that the Ombudsman has to play in the franchising sector. The Morrison government's reforms will also see franchisors subject to increased civil penalties of up to $10 million for engaging in misleading, deceptive or unconscionable conduct under the Australian consumer law, and up to 600 penalty units, which would currently equate to $133,200 per offence for all other offences under the strengthened franchise code. The government is committed to this significant 100%, that is a doubling, of the penalties for breaches of the franchise code. As the enforcement agency for the franchising code, the ACCC has the power to seek penalties for breaches of Australian consumer law. That, again, equates to $10 million, 3 times the value of the benefit received, or 10% of the enterprise's annual turnover in the preceding 12 months, where the court cannot clearly determine the benefit from the offence. So it is the Morrison government that is on the side of franchisees in Australia implementing a stronger framework that adequately addresses the root causes of issues that franchisees face. On 20th of August, as my colleague Senator Brockman has clearly outlined, we announced that the Morrison government was committed to introducing stronger protections and greater transparency for the franchising sector in order to restore confidence and enable this important part of the Australian economy to go from strength to strength. Our reforms, as I've clearly stated, go much further, covering a broader range of issues and addressing the systemic problems that the Fairness in Franchising report has articulated. It is the Morrison government that can be trusted to implement a stronger framework to deliver improved franchisor standards of conduct and stay on the side of Australian small business. The government is committed to a timely implementation of these measures, thereby restoring confidence in the franchising sector. This comprehensively addresses a broad range of problems identified in the Fairness in Franchising report and doesn't simply seek to make a political point out of the limited number of points that Senator O'Neill's bill has raised. I guess we can point to this because we haven't seen a spread on the back of the Fin Review today, and we haven't been in here articulating promises that don't adequately address the issues that are faced every day by Australians out in the economy in this important sector. By increasing the penalties, by addressing systemic concerns, by, furthering the Morrison government's clear commitment to Australian small business, we are on the side of Australian franchisees and have listened to their concerns carefully. Our track record clearly speaks to this, with the coalition government having delivered a series of very important policy reforms since 2013 that saw more than 1.5 million jobs created before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are in a better, stronger and more resilient position than many countries around the world because we listen to business, we get business and we respond to the concerns of business in Australia. The assistance that we provided through the COVID-19 pandemic has built upon this substantial track record of putting in place actual policies that mean something to Australian small business. So far from grandstanding on this important issue, and far from turning our back on the needs of Australian small businesses, we are here with a meaningful, carefully considered and comprehensive range of reforms that are far-reaching, will be meaningful and actually deliver benefit to those Australians who we clearly heard needed our assistance through the Fairness in Franchising report. It was Labor that voted against tax relief for small and medium business 15 times in the last parliament. It was the Labor Party that went to the last election with $387 billion in additional taxes. $387 billion in additional taxes. And now, to make a political point out of this, Senator O'Neill would seek to disrupt, undermine and dissuade people from supporting this very important process. Senators, the Morrison government will address this. We've been clear about the way in which it will benefit Australians, and we look forward to the support from the crossbench when we seek to do so. I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Small. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. As a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I note that this is a real David and Goliath battle that Senator O'Neill has taken on, and she's taken it on well. I point to one corner, we have General Motors, one of the world's largest corporations, ruthlessly abandoning its franchisees in this country, doing it without any consideration, and the government stood by and watched. Families that have put their businesses together over decades, blood, sweat and tears, lots of hard work. Small to medium businesses ploughed so much work into their businesses as well. And what do we see? Just divested by General Motors, tossed aside on the scrap heap. And the government delayed. It promised to address this issue, but has still failed to do so. No wonder people are feeling concerned, afraid, vulnerable, very worried at the hands of large multinational companies with huge imbalances of power. General Motors is treating their franchisees, the Holden dealers, right across this country, Holden dealers, small businesses often, with decades of history, treating them like dirt. Now we have Mercedes lining up to do the same, and Honda and Renault. A company that has worked so admirably around the world with its dealers, now looking to quit its dealer network as well. These companies stealing databases that have been built up over decades. Queensland rural dealerships. I mean, look at our country, look at our state rather. It's the most decentralised of any. It's the only state with more people in the rural areas than in the city, than in the capital city. And those dealer networks need support. But it's not just car dealers, it's also boat dealers, marine dealers, water sport dealers, motorbike dealers. And it's not just wheel dealers, it's people with small business franchises right across this country. And what they're needing is support. They're needing fairness, and they're needing support for locals, for small business. They're needing some security, some certainty. 60,000 workers in this sector alone, in the auto sector alone, according to Senator O'Neill, and that includes many, many tradesmen, many apprentices, good people, local community businesses. And I want to commend Senator O'Neill, because Senator O'Neill came to us to explain her bill. She asked for our support. She did her research. She was willing to answer questions, be on call at any time just to answer her questions and put her staff on call to us. I acknowledge that through you, Deputy Chair, to Senator O'Neill, I appreciate it and I endorse her work. She works. And if Labor senators had the same enthusiasm in general as Senator O'Neill, then we'd be able to work with them much, much better. We commend Senator O'Neill for the way in which she has done so, and she came to us just freely offering us her bill. Senator O'Neill, sadly, is one of the very few real Labor senators in this parliament. I know at least 20% of Labor senators are upset with the way Labor has turned against workers, abandoned workers in favour of woke policies supporting the globalist agenda. Look at things like taxation policy. Look at things like energy policy, destroying manufacturing. And the Liberals and Nationals are similar. They're just a matter of grades apart. But the Labor Party's policies and the Liberal National policies are abandoning manufacturing. They're swallowing the UN dictates, the UN Kyoto Protocol, the UN Paris Agreement, which is not really an agreement, and going back to 1975, the UN's Lima Declaration, the UN Kyoto Protocol, UN Paris Agreement, Lima Declaration, all selling out manufacturing, selling out to some extent all industry, including agriculture. And what about the free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements? We want instead fair trade agreements. Labor support for free trade agreements means that they're selling out workers and Australian employers, small and large. Tax policies, as I said, that let foreign multinationals off the hook. Labor Party in Bob Hawke's era as Prime Minister let them off the hook with petroleum rent resources tax. And yet a few Labor senators stand up for workers, but sadly they're in a very small minority. And when I look at immigration, look at pay rates that are stagnant because of rising immigration until COVID. And with rising costs and stagnant pay, it means living standards are falling. Look at the shortage, look at the oversupply of workers so that we've got a shortage of jobs. Sorry, an abundance of jobs and a shortage of an oversupply of workers, so I beg your pardon, oversupply of workers that are driving wage rates down. Look at the pressure on housing, driving housing prices up. Look at the pressure on infrastructure in this country because the Labor is tied to this large country policy, let in many, many immigrants, far more than we need. Look at the gender bending, the school indoctrination and the trendy virtue signalling that is taking over the Labor Party. And we have good senators like Senators Stirl, Farrell, Gallagher, Sheldon and others. Great to work with. They support workers. They're honest people. And yet they are saddened that the Labor Party has abandoned them. The Labor Party has swamped them in woke policies. So while Senator O'Neill supports real Australian businesses, her party has largely abandoned workers. Look at the energy sector. Coal tossed on the scrap heap by Labor's virtue signallers. Look at industrial relations, where Mr Joel Fitzgibbon abandoned and neglected the abused and exploited workers in the Hunter Valley. Workers that I had to come in and support from Queensland with Stuart Bonds our candidate in the Hunter. Selling out our sovereignty to the UN globalists. These are the things that Labor now stands for. And as Senator O'Neill has showed her leadership in coming to work with all the parties on the crossbench and the Greens, as Senator Whish-Wilson has complimented her, and rightly so, we would expect that Labor would have a reasonable accommodation in play. We would reasonably expect that Labor Party would have an attitude that would be more favourable to Senator Hanson's bill to get foreign companies to pay tax on petroleum resources. Yet Labor denied support to our bill. And when we asked them why, just a blank stare. Nothing, no reason, no justification. So I will finish with this, talking about this bill by emphasising the two major benefits. It brings compulsory arbitration to rectify the imbalance between those who have enormous power like General Motors and the franchisees who have limited power. And the massive increase in penalties, all justified to restore some balance in power. However, the Australian Financial Review rightly said today that this is just a plugging the hole in the dike. Labor has lost its way in policy. Labor has lost its way in our Senate. But One Nation will reiterate again that we will support all parties, yet we expect parties to work with us and to give us a fair go. I support this bill, and I thank Senator O'Neill again for her leadership in reaching out to me in my office. We will work happily with Senator O'Neill, and I remind the Labor Party that if they ever get back into power, they will need to work with us. They will need to work with us. We will be happy to work with people like Senator O'Neill, Senator Farrell, Senator Stirls, Senator Gallagher, Senator Sheldon. These are the people, sadly they're in a minority, but we will happily work with Senator O'Neill and her like.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Senator Van.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. And I rise, and while I'll be not supporting this bill, I do thank Senator O'Neill for all her efforts on this bill and for her tireless efforts around franchising. This is a speech I've long wanted to give in this place. For a bit of background, prior to being elected to the Senate, I worked very closely with the franchising sector. I was a voluntary director on the Australian Association of Franchisees, which Senator Whish-Wilson mentioned earlier, and have worked with most of the organisations that he named. The Parliamentary Joint Committee of Corporation Financial Services did an incredibly thorough investigation of franchising, and both Senator Neal and all the members on that committee, particularly driven by Michael Sukkar as the chair, and before him Steve Irons. I sat in on almost all of those inquiries, and I'm probably one of the few senators, probably one of the few people on the planet that read all of the submissions to that inquiry. Those submissions were harrowing, absolutely harrowing, about the effects that the power imbalance in franchising had on small businesses. Because Senator Farrell, and I'll come to that, and I'll take your interjections anytime because you're just going to help me reinforce my points. Those stories were harrowing. The complete and utter devastation caused to people's lives by that power imbalance, which is written into the code. The code is not the right instrument for this. And so while I say I'm not going to support Senator O'Neill's bill, it's not because it's not a step in the right direction, it truly is. But the government's legislation that's pending, and as everyone in this place knows, there's been extraordinary consultation going on about that. The legislation that's pending that will come before this place goes an awful lot further. So why take a one small step when we can take a giant leap? Now, on that, the inquiry heard about that power imbalance that I talked about before, and it gave that the inquiry gave franchisees the ability to be able to have their voices heard, and their report and the recommendations came forward were incredibly important. There's no doubt that the franchising code is effectively broken, and there have been numerous attempts to reform the franchising code since it was initially introduced in 1998, including a complete rebuild of the code in 2015. However, as Senator O'Neill mentioned, there's been 17 inquiries into this code, and yet we still run into these systemic problems and the ongoing issues that occur within the sector. The submissions and testimony of franchisees, coupled with the near-criminal responses from the leadership of some notable franchisors, show the drastic need for reform to help protect the investments of franchisees. And that's not to say franchising cannot work or doesn't work. There is an incredible number of wonderful franchise systems out there. I'd probably say the split is something like 90% to 10% good versus bad. There is such strong examples of franchising working, and they're powerful businesses. They're powerful businesses that do a lot to grow this economy. They employ hundreds of thousands of people and contribute billions to the Australian economy. The the problem with Senator O'Neill's bill is it just doesn't go far enough. And while I think it's a valid attempt, and I do congratulate her for taking on that role and for doing so, and standing up in her caucus to do so. However, with it not going far enough, we need to look at what we can further do. And so the draft amendments to the franchising code that this government is suggesting will improve disclosure on significant capital expenditure, supplier rebates and marketing funds. It'll prevent franchisors passing on legal costs to franchisees and respective variation of franchise agreements. Improve end-of-franchise relationships, including cooling off, early exit, termination and restraint of trade arrangements. Strengthen dispute resolution options and double penalties to deter poor conduct in the sector. And no one in this place should be under any disillusion. There is a lot of poor conduct in this sector. Given how important it is to our economy, that needs to be stamped down. So I strongly believe in the way that the Morrison government is tackling this issue. I believe it is going to bring a lot of change into the sector, far more than Senator O'Neill's bill will do. But that doesn't mean we can't go further. Some of the reforms that I've suggested include looking at the base legislation of franchising. Is an industry code the right way to do it? Does it sitting in consumer law, is that the best protections that we can provide to these small businesses? And my argument would be it's not. And I'll explain why I think that. If you look at franchising in its most simplest way, it is quite literally one business saying to another, we want to grow our business, so if you contribute some capital and some sweat equity, we'll all be able to grow. So any way you look at it, that is a form of capitalisation of another business. So as a form of capitalisation, it should be treated as an investment. Now, it's not the same as an equity investment nor a debt investment, but it is an investment nonetheless. And therefore, I think it long-term, and I do mean long-term because these changes won't come about simply or easily, we should be committing to looking at changing the franchising sector to being covered by consumer law, by the Australian Consumer Law, to being covered by the Corporations Act. I think it sits in there much more solidly than it does under consumer law. And that will force some of this behaviour that goes on by franchisors. And I can point my fellow senators to any number of franchise agreements that lock in ways that the franchisors only ever going to be the only ever winner out of that agreement, whether it be through the churning and burning that was mentioned before, whether it be by putting all the onus on leases for capital, leases for premises, etc., totally on that small business, on the franchisee, and locks in their disadvantage, locks in that power imbalance. And that is something that we do need to resolve. So what I've proposed to my colleagues and leadership is that franchising sector should be put before the Australian Law Reform Commission for review, and for it to be looked at from the grassroots up as to how we can better structure legislation around franchising to give maximum protection to small business while enabling franchising to succeed and to really truly be the generator of wealth for our economy that we've seen it can be, such that we're seeing the best franchising systems succeeding even more than they are now, and we all know that there are some very successful ones out there. But we stamp out this power imbalance such that it's gone forever, that we no longer hear the stories of people losing their houses. I think the best example I can provide is the Pizza Hut franchisees, who, when they were told overnight that they were going to have to sell pizzas for under $5. Now, that didn't come with a subsidy from the franchisor. That didn't come with any rebate for selling those pizzas below cost. They were forced to do it. And the franchising code and their franchising agreement, which was covered by that code, allowed the franchisor to do that. that put an incredible number of small businesses to the wall, and that cannot be allowed to happen again. So while I sadly won't be supporting Senator O'Neill's bill, I do thank her for her tireless efforts in this and for all the Parliamentary Joint Committee, every member of that, including Senator Whish-Wilson's work on that committee. I think we have further to go. I'd like to see both sides of Parliament work together on this. Senator O'Neill and I have discussed this quite regularly, and I hope to keep that line of communication open, how we can improve the franchising sector. And I thank the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Van. Senator O'Neill.
If it is okay, I would like to
Yes.
sum up the debate now.
Yep.
Can I thank all the senators for participating in the debate? I acknowledge the contributions of the government members. Senator Van, thank you for your kind words about the efforts that have been made by the committee, which did deliver that unanimous report. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of the new Senator Small from Western Australia and the not-so-new Senator Brockman from Western Australia. At least I made the effort to come in here and speak on it. But it's kind of got to a point, Deputy President, where the Australian people are pretty well over hearing the government come in here, bleating and moaning with statements that begin with, "We care about what's happening to you. We understand what's happening to you." They're the government. Caring and understanding are the beginning of action. But what's missing from this government is action. And the sector that they're abandoning by not supporting this bill today is the small business sector right across this country. The small business sector that continually are told by the Liberal Party that they are the party for the small business. Well, they're not the party for small business today. They haven't been the party for small business for a very, very long time. And if they do not support this piece of legislation, which I described this morning, it was reported by Adele Ferguson in a very good piece in the Financial Review, this is a finger in the dike. There is so much work to be done in terms of franchising in this country. The government's making a very, very light touch response on a promise. This bill actually does some grunt work and gets protection in place for small businesses that need it right now. I want to thank Senator Whish-Wilson for his contribution, not only on the committee, I know you're no longer a member of that committee, but thank you for the work that you did and your very kind words here, and also in acknowledge the National Senator, Wacker Williams. You know, the Nationals had a heart, a voice and a man of action when they had him in the chamber. And if they really cared about what was going on in small businesses right across this country, particularly in regional and rural Australia, they would be supporting this Labor bill today. They know that this matters. They know that this matters because recently a very good example has emerged, and that is when General Motors just walked all over Australian businesses. We're not talking about little businesses here with regard to car dealers. These are very, very important parts of our local community. Multi-generational small businesses that have grown, that are part of the care economy that happens in our regions across this country, that are part of a dealership network across the country so that when the grey nomads, having worked a long life and paid their taxes, have enough money to get around Australia, know that when they're in Townsville, when they're in Cloncurry, when they're in the Pilbara, when they're in far western New South Wales or even down in Tasmania, that they will be able to get proper service and they will be able to be looked after by a network of high-quality tradespeople who are operating out of these dealership networks across Australia. Well, they got totally done over. That dealership network for General Motors, Holden dealers here got done over by General Motors, an overseas company. And Minister Karen Andrews, Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Michaelia Cash, in concert with them, did nothing to prevent General Motors doing over an entire sector. There was no capacity for them to actually have proper arbitration about General Motors deciding to leave the country. And because they left that sector hanging, there have been changes to business models for Honda, for Renault and for Mercedes-Benz that have walked right through the door because this government hasn't got the guts to do the hard work and stand up for franchisees instead of the very wealthy franchisors and overseas companies. Overseas companies. That's who they chose over hard-working Australian businesses. That's where we are today. I want to thank Senator Roberts from One Nation. I want to be very clear. There are many, many things that Labor will disagree with all of the different political parties are in here. But one thing I am committed to, and my colleagues are committed to, is the practice of democracy. When the Australian people elect people to this House, it is incumbent on all of us to work to get good outcomes for the Australian people. This bill, in my name today, a Labor bill, is a bill to protect small businesses in the absence of a Liberal government, a Liberal National Party government that is leaving them hanging. I want to thank Senator Roberts for his kind words about the hard work of the committee, and I hope that we will get support for this bill today and that it will end up in the House of Representatives and enough people will have the common sense not only to do the work that the government has proposed that they will do, but to do the work now in supporting this bill to give necessary protections urgently needed to make sure no more small businesses that are engaged in a franchise structure are able to be exploited, because that cannot help us in our recovery. The scale of why this matters, I just want to reiterate from my original remarks. The franchising sector accounts for 7% of the GDP. This is no small thing. We won't have a car dealership network standing in 2 years after the government's watched and waited. What Australians know as a network that they rely on and support will be gone. So I urge you, senators, particularly senators on the crossbench, join with Labor in supporting small business today. I urge the Nationals, have a heart, have the guts to stand up for your local small businesses. Come in and support this bill, and let's get this done as a first important step towards further reforms that the government has heralded.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill. So the question is that the bills be now read a second time. Those of that opinion say aye. Against? I believe the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bell for 4 minutes. It's the private sentence bill. Yeah, so we just started there. I don't know. Unless we approve that.
Lock the doors. The question is the bill be read a second time. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Urquhart teller for the ayes, Senator Dean Smith teller for the noes.